So now that we know what implicit measures are, let me talk a little bit about kind of findings and misconceptions. So it would have probably be better called misconceptions and findings. So there are a lot of ideas about what implicit measures, implicit bias is. And some of them are, as you will see in this chapter, fundamentally wrong. We will address these kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ones. So I highlighted the first one. Does everyone have it? In the previous chapter, I said I will not talk about this again. This is actually not true. I will come back to that. I want to kind of reevaluate that statement and kind of show that it's a little bit more complicated to answer this question than simply saying like, oh, we are all racist or we are not all racist, or some of us are racist and some of us are not racist, but it depends a little bit more on some subtle factors. And I come back to that, and I think once at the end of this chapter, we have a really rich understanding of how the research in this area is conducted, but also what we know about the implicit bias. We will start basically with the most kind of, which is like eye-catching claim that implicit bias is unconscious. There's something in you and me, the idea here is, there's something that basically drives our behavior that we are not aware of. We somehow act and then try to explain it, but we can't because we are not aware of it, right? This is basically often the start of any kind of unconscious bias training, where it's like, well, we are not aware of it. We have to somehow pull it, make it aware. We have to find ways to deal with our unconscious bias. Here's like a quote by Greenwald, research guided by the conceptual roots of the IIT emphasizes the idea that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. So how come? Why was there kind of like maybe the first or the second generation or early research on the IIT? Why is this idea out there of the unconscious bias? So here's a classic study by Dovidio and colleagues in 2001, and we will come back to this study later again. But imagine you're coming into a lab, you're a student, and you're white in this case, and first you have to kind of measure your explicit attitudes towards black. So it was 2001, so it could be on a computer. Most likely you're still using paper and pencil, and you would ask something like, I would rather not have blacks live in the same apartment building that I live in. Interracial marriage should be discouraged to avoid the who am I confusion which the children feel, and so forth. So kind of in a tradition of the modern racism scale, more subtle yet explicit ways of asking for racial attitudes. And thereafter you would do one variation of the kind of Fazio's automatic evaluation task. So here you see either a black face or a white face for 23 milliseconds. So this is often what is called a subliminal prime. So it's so quick that people can't or have trouble reporting whether they saw a black or white face. There's a whole literature on whether this is actually subliminal, whether people actually see it or not. I don't want to go into that. But here the authors claim it is a subliminal processing. As you probably know by now, if you use a mask thereafter, a mask like this, they use geometric figures actually in their study that kind of erases the content that is in your sensory memory, right? And thereby it's gone. So hence you increase the likelihood that participants are not aware of what they have seen. So basically what they should see is just the word rats or ice cream, and then they're asked, or many different other positive or negative words, and they have to indicate whether they like them or not. So this is the same idea as Ross Fazio's automatic evaluation task, right? If you have an activation of a positive affect of a white face, an automatic activation of a positive, automatic positive activation, an automatic positive affective response to white faces, then this should make it harder to process something negative thereafter, but easier to process something positive. And you can say the opposite for a black face. So if you have an automatic negative evaluation of a black face, then it should be harder to process positive things and easier to process negative things. I can take the difference, and that will tell me if you have a preference for white over black people. what you can see here is a classic finding, right? And I'll come back a little bit. You can see there's some things missing in the study. We'll come back later on to the study. What you can see here is basically a non-existing relationship between the explicit attitudes and the implicit attitudes. So this is often taken as a sign like, oh, people are not aware of them, right? They say one thing, but they do another thing. So correlations between implicit and explicit measures are generally low. Depending on the area, depending on what is measured, they're between 0 and 0.2 or 3. I think meta-analytical evidence suggests. They increase a little bit if you say like, hey, go with your gut feeling when you answer these questions. So kind of rely on your implicit attitudes when you answer this explicit attitude measure, but not by much. And so here's something that I kind of want to elaborate a little bit more on. But basically here, this is like, if you kind of like in contemporary dialogues about racism, often what we hear is like, oh, there are traditional racists. The traditional racist would be kind of a person who has an implicit and explicit, strong negative bias towards an outgroup member. So it could be a white person. We had Charles Manson in the video beforehand, and he says, if you ask him, do you like black people? He says no. And if he doesn't take the IAT, he says no. So we have a person that's not conflicted at all, but kind of obnoxiously racist, okay? But then there are others, and this is basically a claim that this is you and me, depending on in-group and out-group members, where we don't have these explicit attitudes anymore. They're kind of gone. They're a thing of the past, but implicitly we still have them. That's kind of like the modern racism. It's harder to tackle is the idea. And this comes from this kind of lack of correlation between explicit and implicit attitudes or prejudice that we find in so many areas. Yet, this claim is a little bit complicated. And if you think a little bit more about it, then you might feel, well, is that the whole story? So one thing is kind of what we had when we talked about attitudes. We talked about this idea by Fishbein and Eisen and Fishbein in their review of basically the link between attitudes and behaviors. If you want to have a strong correlation between measures, you need to measure exactly the same thing, right? So if I ask you, hey, basically I ask you, do you like black people or don't you like black people, right? Okay. So you might say, oh, I love black people. I have no problem with that. And this is my intention, this is my explicit attitude. I do not prefer white people over black people. I'm egalitarian. Okay, so this would be hopefully your explicit attitude, but now you are basically asked to do this implicit measure, right? It could be that you're aware of that you're not doing very well on this implicit measure, right? On an IAT or anything automatic evaluation task, yet that wouldn't change. That's not what you were asked, right? You were not asked to say, how would you do on this test? You were asked to say whether you explicitly have a preference of white people over black people. So it seems like they're measuring two different things. So this is basically research, the idea that Adam Hahn and his colleagues did in this fantastic 2014 paper. And so what they ask people is to say, these white participants, you will see very different variations of the IAT, but they used an IAT, and they basically said, like, look, do the test, and then tell me, predict your own performance on that test. Before and afterhand, they either explained them first this procedure and tell me what do you think the results will show, or they did it thereafter. What do you think your results showed? So now they directly ask you, are you aware of your performance on this implicit bias? And here you can see the predicted scores across studies, and here you can see the actual IATD scores, the different scores, right? And you can here see basically this is a preference for one over the other, and here this is neutral. And so for the race IAT, for Asians, for Latinos, celebrities, I'm not sure what celebrity is. I think, if you prefer celebrities over normal people, it seems like there's a slight preference for normal people in quotation marks and for children. So here it seems like you prefer children over adults, but what you can see that this is like the predicted curve, and now we have the same here, the same curve almost to the dot of the actual performance. So people were insanely accurate in predicting their performance on the IIT. They were aware of their bias that the IIT proclaimed exists. Okay, so it's not that it's unconscious, not unconscious at all. There are other studies who kind of further tear down the idea of unconscious bias. No, people are relatively aware of that. They're aware of there's something in me that lets me kind of process positive words more easily after white faces than black faces. It's not an unconscious bias. It is an implicit bias, but not an unconscious bias. So the first lesson we are kind of learning is that there's no evidence that people are unaware of their implicit bias. People are aware of their biases, okay? They might not admit it, but they can predict their performance on these measures. Oh, it's really important to know. That's why I use implicit bias, right? One really important question now that you might have is like, okay, so there's this thing that's called an implicit bias. It's supposedly unconscious, but it's not. We find that people react, like press these buttons, and then they react in a certain way, and there's the bias. But what do we actually have as an evidence that this indicates that it has any relationship with prejudice and racism in the world? And to put this as a scientist, it was like, does it actually drive the implicit bias actually behavior? How is it related to behavior? So there's a bit of discussion about this. This should actually be Gawronski 2019 there. Sorry for this mistake here. But what he cites is basically saying also some researchers suggest that statistically small relations between implicit bias and behavior could nevertheless have large society effects. The obtained average correlations are certainly disappointing. So in the beginning, I think there was this idea that, we measure the IIT and the IIT can finally explain all these types of racist behavior, prejudice behavior in different parts of our society that we see, okay? Because the explicit attitude sure can't, so now the implicit should. And then what you can see, it's really, really important, and I'll come back to that in a second or in a minute to be more accurate. It's really important that every type of meta-analysis on this topic finds an effect that the IIT has. It's a small effect, but we always find correlations between IIT and behavior. It's not that we don't find that. We wish, or maybe some people wish, they would be larger. But here again, it's really important to kind of think about this correspondence principle. So what type of behavior are we trying to predict? What type of behavior should an IIT actually predict? So do you remember our wonderful stereotypical student here with his hat turned backwards? He just, we're back in a study. He just did an explicit measure of attitudes. He did an implicit measure of his racial attitudes here with this variation of the automatic evaluation procedure. And now he's led into a room. So in this room, we have him, we have a Confederate, another student. They had to use Confederates because in this large American university, they couldn't find enough black students for these interactions, so they had to hire people to act as black students, which kind of tells you a little bit of the state of the art. It's 2001. It's a kind of sad statement to read, but nevertheless, that's not important for the study here. So, and what they are asked to do is have a 3-minute interaction with each other, discussing the topic of dating in the current era. Has it some advantage and disadvantage to earlier periods? Please consider and discuss what you personally feel are disadvantaged and disadvantaged. To just make it a little bit more natural, this was in a room with 2 cameras. They also had microphones positioned here. And so you could basically, he was videotaped and she was videotaped, and they had this conversation. Thereafter, they both went to the individual rooms and basically were asked on several questions, kind of, what was your impression? How did you do? Do you think you made a good impression? Were you friendly? How did you behave? What do you think about the other person? How did they behave? Okay, so both of them gave like the real impressions of the conversations. What did you feel during it? How did you feel about it? Now, You saw a little bit of this table already. These are the results. You saw this a bit here, the lack of correlation between the explicit and the implicit prejudice. But let's have a look at basically with what the explicit, let's start with explicit. What does the explicit actually correlate? There, you see two strong correlations here. And if we kind of look, what a 3 is the verbal behavior. So if I, for instance, say something like, okay, if I have positive, explicit attitudes towards black people, then I'm more likely to kind of say something along those lines, okay? So the things I say, the way I behave, because I'm explicitly aware that this is what I should do, things that I can somewhat easily control, have a strong correlation with the explicit attitudes, right? The other thing is my self-perception. So the guy here in the room, when he was asked, how did you do? And if he has a positive attitude towards black people and a positive explicit attitude towards black people, then he would say, well, I did very well. I think I was really friendly. But I think what you can see here, the implicit attitude was more, has these two, or has these basically these 3 strong correlations, okay? For one, it correlates with the nonverbal behavior. So they videotaped it and then rated the nonverbal behavior, how positive or negative was that, coders coded that, and the stronger your implicit prejudice, the less positive was your, or basically the more positive your implicit prejudice was towards black people, the more positive your verbal behavior. Things that are tougher to control, right? Then the Confederate's perception. So number 6 is here. What you see is that how the other person felt you do. Were you actually friendly or were you not friendly? Okay. So the idea here is a little bit like, let's say you say something really friendly, but your body language says you don't really mean it. And so it seems like what the other person kind of picked up on here, what the black person picked up when they talked to a white person, is that there's some disconnect. They didn't really, it was genuine friendliness. So here you can see that implicit prejudice basically predicted your nonverbal behavior and also how the other person felt, and also how observers rated your behavior. As you can see, observers didn't feel very convinced about your performance if you had explicitly a positive. It seems like, although it's not significant, there's a small negative impact. So it doesn't really seem that your explicit attitude was perceived as genuine, rather your implicit attitude was driving it. So here you can see there are 2 different sets of behavior, if you can kind of abstract a little bit from that correlate with implicit measures. So it's not all behaviors, but it's spontaneous behaviors, right? Kind of non-verbal interactions. Then there's behavior performed under conditions that impair cognitive deliberation, so under stress. Right? This is when implicit biases matter more, very much in ambiguous situations. And it also has a stronger prediction in people who do not like to think a lot. Okay? So if you are a very kind of go with your guts person, not think too much about a situation and so forth, then your implicit predict better your behavior. But if you're very controlled and deliberative, then not. So I think the lesson here that to be learned that I want you to take away is that there's no unconditional correlation between implicit attitudes and behavior, yet there is a conditional. There's a really important impact on that measures like the IAT have on certain types of behaviors, and often these behaviors are the behaviors that we really care about. If I genuinely am perceived as an egalitarian person when I talk to a person of another race, that's what I care about, and so if I care about that, then I should really care about my own implicit bias and what I can do about it. So I think when I, with my collaborator, or one of that mentioned before, and Adam Hahn, who did a study on whether people can actually predict their own IIT behavior, when I said, like, why are you always taking the IIT? The processes in the IIT are so much less understood than, for instance, the processes in the automatic evaluation task suggested by Rob Fazio. And he would always say, because it is the best predictor of behavior for all our implicit measures. So especially the IIT has a really good Small, but for specific behaviors, really good prediction of predicting behavior. So keep that in mind. So I put here, it depends. Now we're talking about, is implicit bias stable over time? It's another one of these kind of famous, we get them and then we have them and we can't shake them off. So there's a narrative that Gawronski writes that according to which a person scores on an implicit measure reflects a trait-like characteristic on that person, and these traits are acquired early in childhood and remain stable over the course of the development. So there's this little girl here, she sees something, she learns something, she acquires a negative attitude towards, for instance, black people, and then later on, if I test her again, she still has that. And it's basically stable over time. One of the most famous findings in this era is one by Barron and Benaggi. And basically what they show here is like they test 6-year-olds. They have a child IIT where you don't have to, where the words are spoken out. So you don't have to read words, which is the biggest change. And they have faces of children. But you can see here, this is the IIT. These are the D scores, of the IIT, like the different scores. There's it's almost comical how similar they are. It's really important to me. This is not the same person. So they tested 6-year-olds, then a different set of children at the same time were 10-year-olds and adults. But you can see that basically all of these groups have more or less the same implicit bias. So this is kind of but then you see for explicit, it's basically over the course of the lifetime, these children get more and more egalitarian, which is like 80% is really sad here. 6-year-olds. This is very strongly moderated by whether these children actually live in a neighborhood where they have already met black people or not, which we come a little bit or in the next section about. So this is not that this is true for everyone, but here we're taking, look at these results. Oh my God, we get it when we're young and we can never shake it off. They're stable, and hence this is kind of like, this is something we should look more into it. Yet, if you kind of do classic temporal stability measures, if you kind of correlate your IIT with today, with your IIT that you would take in a year or that you did take a year ago, then you find basically the opposite. You find that the average stability, this is just for 1 month, I think here, 1 to 2 months periods, the average stability for implicit measures is 0.54, so there's an overlap of 24% if you think about that, right? 25% between these measures. So there's a moderate correlation between my IIT now and your IIT next time, but it's not crazy high. It's not very stable, but for explicit ones, it's much higher. So what we find basically, if I compare my score to today to my score in a year or my score in 5 years, that my explicit attitudes much better predict my explicit attitudes than my implicit attitudes predict my implicit attitudes. In the next chapter, we talk more about why this is the case. But here's the next lesson, just implicit bias is less, not more stable over time than explicit bias. So we have the kind of like the next kind of narrative that's not right. Let's talk about the last one, and then we are done. So this might sound a little bit complicated. Is implicit bias not affected by context? So what do I mean by this? Sorry, I forgot to take off this animation. So there's basically the idea, right, of the IIT, that you see a face. You see a black face, or you see a white face. Here, just for some bizarre reason, I only put black faces in. So you see a black face that automatically activates a negative evaluation, and hence, if you have a preference, but for most people, as you have seen, this automatically, for most white people, this automatically, or better, for most non-black people, this automatically activates negative affect, and hence you have this preference in your response times, in your reaction times. But the idea here is, right, there's nothing about context. It doesn't matter which face it is. It doesn't matter whether you meet that person at night night or in church or at work. Wherever you are, it's the same automatic reaction. So the idea here would be basically that you're almost like a Pavlovian dog, right? The moment you hear a bell, something happens. So this is a true kind of idea of automatic responses, that they're not moderated by context, not moderated by motivation, not moderated by anything, but always the same thing. There's one stimulus, and this stimulus is the color of the skin, and that automatically activates something. Yet, I think nothing could be further from the truth. Here on the left, you see Oh My Little. I don't know if you have not watched Wire, then I think you should stop now and spend the next 72 hours watch this TV show. Really lovable character. And he can see here's like a little bit of a gun sticking out, and he also has a vest on. So it's basically like if you see a person like that, you might have automatically a negative evaluation. But if you see these guys on the right, you're having fun in the choir, why would you have a negative evaluation? Why would that activate anything negatively in your mind? But the idea of the IIT is that this doesn't matter. This is the same. It's only about skin color. So if I would cut out his, basically in his context, and that's all that matters. But here in this quite famous study by Wittenbrink and colleagues, what they saw is that, okay, if I show black faces at kind of like in a street context or in a choir context, people have vastly different attitudes, implicit attitudes towards them, okay? So there's a lot of variability. There's another one where you basically, this is about kind of sexism. And it's actually about like women being convinced that women can be leaders by experiencing other women in leadership roles. So this is seeing as believing, and you can see that here is the title basically says it all: exposure to counter stereotypical women leaders and its effect on the malleability of automatic standard stereotyping. The interesting thing about this study is that this is basically compares women who have experienced female leadership with women who have not experienced a lot of female leadership, and they can find basically the more female leadership you see, the less you have these kind of gender stereotypical ideas about that men are better leader than women. So here it depends, right, on the context. If you're in one context where there's female leadership, you have much less like stereotypical activations, automatic stereotypical activations, where if you're in a context where there's more, no, it's the other way around, right? Let me say that again. If you're in a context where nobody is a female leader, then you will have automatically kind of the perception that this women are not made to be female leaders. Yet if you're in a country like Germany or Taiwan or New Zealand, you have a very different experience. Your country is led by a woman like that, by a woman, and hence you might have, you have very different automatic evaluations. So the context really matters. Your experience really matters. This is something just quickly to kind of show a lot of people who's like, oh, how did Obama and his reign as president from 2008 to 2016, sorry, my math is not very good, how did this impact basically explicit race attitudes and implicit race attitudes? And you can see in general there's a slow yet kind of trend down. Here's a stronger actually in implicit attitudes. You can see here that basically for explicit attitudes, in order to them to become neutral, if this trend is followed, we would need 21 more years. If we want to have neutral implicit, we would have to wait 57 years more if this trend continues. Somewhat depressing, but yet we can see we're making progress. But this is not true for everyone. You can see, for instance, attitudes towards overweight people or obese people is dramatically going negative. So between 2005 and 2015, you can see it's coming really increased negative attitudes towards obese people or overweight people, and some attitudes just don't change. It seems like a real strong negative preference attitude towards disability, and you can basically see that there's no indication that this will change any time soon. I think it's really important to kind of think about this for a second. And here Gawronski writes basically, in fact, the available evidence suggests that contextual factors determine virtually every finding with implicit measures, including the overall scores, the temporal stabilities, the predictions of future behavior, and the effectiveness of interventions. So let me kind of unravel that a moment, because I think it's really important before we draw to a close. So what he's saying is basically that the context really matters. So if I want basically have strong temporal stability, right, strong correlation, then I need to measure the same, basically the same test in the same context. If the moment I change the contents, then the overall stability will go down. So you can just kind of think a little bit about this, right? Okay, this is about temporal stability. I should have started with overall scores. So you can think about, like, let's say I go to City. Our university is wonderfully diverse, right? I'll be tested in City. I have wonderful interactions with a really diverse crowd of students. And now I do the IIT. I have like a real positive IIT score to whatever outgroup member I'm being measured. And then let's say I go somewhere where it's like, let's say in rural Germany, I have no interactions with any outgroup members, and hence that will then I take an IIT. This will will indicate that I have a bias towards the in-group. So it really depends on which context you're in for your overall score. The same, and I think I just said it, for temporal stability. If I measure my IIT at a City and then 2 months later in Germany, in rural Germany, then I have vastly different temporal stability if I would have the same score measured basically twice at City University. Okay, it's also kind of like context matters also basically for the prediction of future behavior, right? If I want to predict how, let's say the university wants to know how I have a preference for let's say in-group students over out-group students, right? Then they would have to measure in that context my implicit IIT, and they would try, if they find anything, they would try to have changed that within the context of their university, within the context of students, within the context of my interactions with students, right? That is the important, and if that would then really help to predict my behavior. And we talked a little bit about the specifics of the behavior, and also obviously about the effectiveness of interventions, right? If we want to design interventions that actually change implicit bias, and I said it, implicit bias is important in some areas for real important behavior, then we have to think about that context. We have to be specific about this context. What is it in this context that activates negative automatic evaluations towards outgroup members, okay? So context matters dramatically. Let me just kind of come back with a last sentence to this. Does everyone have it, right? And the answer is more, in which context do we have it? And how is it measured, right? So it's not so much that, basically I have it and you have it all the time. No, I might have it in the morning, might not have it in a different context at home, right? I might have very different interactions that really change the way I, for momentarily, temporarily perceive an outgroup member. So it's not so much that it's like everyone has it. We probably everyone has it from time to time, but I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It would be better to think about it, okay, where do we have it and where don't we have it?